End of chapter 9. Then we'll do chapter 10. Vulgar lunged forward and his saber spun, wrapping around Alex like a snake and yanking it with it from his grip. Metal flashed as the sword soared across the barn, burying itself in the half-rotten wall of the trunk with a thunk. The wall count stripped forward and held his saber at Alec's throat. And what can we conclude from this lesson, Your Highness? Alec glared at the man. We can conclude, Count Vogler, that this discussing politics with fencing is idiotic. Vogler smiled. For most people, perhaps, but some of us are born without the choice. The game of nations is your birthright, Alec. Politics is part of everything you do. Alec pushed Vogler's saber aside. Without a sword in his hand, he suddenly felt numb and exhausted, and he didn't have the strength to argue against the obvious. His birthright, his birth had shaken the Austrian-Hungary throne, and now his parents' death had unsettled the delicate balance of Europe. So this war is my responsibility, he said bitterly. No, Alec, the clanker and Darwinist powers would have found a way to fight sooner or later, but perhaps you can still make your mark. How? Alec asked. The wildcat did a strange thing then. He took his own saber by the blade and handed it to Alec, pommel first, and offered it to a victor. We shall see, Alec. We shall see. Chapter 10. He eased the saunter sideways and felt the stormwalker's right foot shift. That's it, Odaclop said. Slowly now. Alec nudged the control again, and the walker slid a little farther. It was frustrating maneuvering in tight quarters like this. One bump of the walker's shoulder could send the whole rotten barn crashing down around them. At least the tumbling gauges and levers had begun to make sense. A little more pressure on the knees might help. With another nudge, he done it. The viewport was lined up with a ragged gap in the wall of the barn. The late afternoon sun shone into the cabin, the fields stretching out before them. A harvesting combine rumbled along on 12 legs in the distance. A dozen farmers and a four-legged truck followed to collect the bundled grain. Count Volger put a hand on Alec's shoulder. Wait till they're out of sight. Well, obviously, Alec said, with his bruises still throbbing. He'd had enough of Volger's counseling for one day. The combine made its slow way across the field, finally disappearing behind the low hill. A few workmen strangling behind, black dots in the horizon. Alec soon lost them in the distance, but waited. Finally, Bauer's voice crackled in the intercom. That's the last one gone, sir. Corporal Bauer had the uncanny eyesight of an expert gunner. 2 weeks ago, he'd been on his way to commanding a machine of his own. Master Hoffman had been the Habsburg Guard's best engineer, but now the two were nothing more than fugitives. Alec had slowly come to understand everything the men had given up for him, their ranks, families, and futures. If they were caught, the other four would hang as deserters. Prince Alexander himself would disappear, more quietly, of course, for the good of the empire. The last thing the nation at war needed was uncertainty about who was heir to the throne. He eased the stormwalker toward the barn's open doors, using the shuffling step that Klopp had taught him. It erased the machine's massive footprints, along with any other sign that someone had been hidden there. Ready for your first run, young master? Klopp asked. Alec nodded, flexing his fingers. He was nervous, but glad to be piloting in the daylight for once, instead of the dead of night. And really, Walker falling wasn't so bad. They'd all be bruised and battered, but Master Klopp could get the machine back on its feet again. As the engines pulsed faster, the smell of the exhaust mixed with dust and hay, Alex eased the machine forward, wood creaking as the walker pushed through the doors and out into the fresh air. Smoothly done, young master, Klopp said. There was no time to answer. They were in the open now. Alec brought the Stormwalker to its full height, its engines cycling to their maximum. He urged it forward, stretching the metal legs farther with every step. Then came the moment when walking turned to running, both feet in the air at once. The cabin shuddered with every impact against the ground. Alec heard rye being shredded underfoot. The Stormwalker's trail would be easy to spot from the aeroplane, but by night the harvesting combine would turn back and erase the huge footprints. He kept his eye on the goal, a stream bed covered with shattering trees. This was the fastest he'd ever traveled, faster than any horse, even faster than the express train to Berlin. Each 10-meter stride seemed to stretch out over the endless seconds, graceful in the vast scale of the machine. The thundering pace felt glorious after long nights spent creeping through the forest. But as the steam bed approached, Alec wondered if the walker was moving too fast. How was he supposed to bring them to a halt? He eased back the saunters a bit, and suddenly everything went wrong. The right foot planted too soon, and the machine began to tip. Alec brought the left leg down, but the walker's momentum carried it forward. He was forced to take another step like a careening drunk, unable to stop. "Young Master," Otter began. "Take it," Alec shouted. Klopp seized the saunter and twisted the walker, stretching one leg out, tipping the whole craft back. The pilot's chair spun, and Vulgar swung widely from the hand strap overhead. But somehow Klopp stayed glued to the controls. The Stormwalker skipped onward, one leg outstretched, its front foot ripped through the soil and stalks of rye. Dust spilled into the cabin, and Alec glimpsed the steamed hurtling toward them. Gradually the machine slowed a bit, the momentum lifted it upright, and then it was standing on two legs, hidden among the trees. Two huge feet soaking in the steam. Alec watched dust and torn rye swirl across the viewport. A moment later his hands began to shake. "Well done, young master," Klopp said, clapping him on the back. "But I almost fell." "Of course you did," Klopp laughed. "Everyone falls the first time they try to run." "Everyone what?" "Everyone falls. But you did the right thing and let me take control just in time." Vogel flicked sprigs of rye from his jacket. It seems that humility was the rather tiresome point of the lesson today, along with making sure they looked like proper commoners. Humility. Alex bunched his fists. "You mean you knew I would fall?" "Of course," Klopp said. "As I said, everyone does at first. But you gave up the saunters in time. That's a lesson too." Alex scowled. Klopp was positively beaming at him, as if Alec had just mastered the somersault in a six-legged cutter. He wasn't sure whether to laugh or give the man a good thrashing. He settled for coughing some of the dust out of his lungs, then taking back the controls. The Stormwalker responded normally. It seemed nothing more important than his pride had been damaged. "You did better than I expected," Klopp said, "especially with how top-heavy we are." "Top-heavy?" Alex asked. "Oh, well," Klopp looked at Vogel sheepishly. "I suppose not really." Count Vogel sighed. "Go ahead, Klopp. If we're going to be teaching His Highness Walker acrobats, I suppose it might help to show him the extra cargo." Klopp nodded, a wicked smile on his face. He pulled himself from the commander's seat and knelt by a small engineering panel on the floor. Give me a hand, young master. A little curious now, Alec knelt beside him, and together they loosened the hand screws. The panel plopped open, and Alec blinked. Instead of wires and gears, the opening revealed neat rectangular and dully shining metal, each monogrammed with the Habsburg seal. Are those? Gold bars, Klopp said happily. A dozen of them, almost a quarter of a ton in all. God's wounds, Alec breathed. The contents of your father's personal safe, Count Vogler said, entrusted to us as part of your inheritance. We won't lack for money. I suppose not, Alex sat back. So this is your little secret, Count? I must admit, I'm impressed. This is merely an afterthought. Vogler waved a hand, and Klopp began to seal the panel back up. The real secret is in Switzerland. A quarter ton of gold. An afterthought? Alec looked up at the man. Are you serious? Count Vogler raised his eyebrows. I am always serious. Shall we go? Alec pulled himself back up into the pilot's chair, wondering what this other surprise and the wild count had waiting. Alec stared them down the stream bed toward Linz, the nearest city, with its mechanical industry. The walker desperately needed kerosene and parts, and with a dozen gold bars, they could buy the whole town if need be. The trick was not giving themselves away. The Cyclops Stormwalker was a fairly conspicuous way to travel. Alec kept the machine in the trees along the stream bank, with the afternoon light already fading. They could steal close enough to reach the city on foot tomorrow. It was strange to think that the first time in 2 weeks, Alec would see other people. Not just these 4 men, but an entire town of commoners, none of whom would realize that a prince was walking among them. He coughed again and looked down at his dusty disguise of farmer's clothes. Vogler had been right. He was as filthy as a peasant now. No one would think he was anything special, certainly not a boy with a vast fortune of gold. Klops beside him was equally grubby, but still wore a pleased smile on his face. The end of chapter 10.